So I've been giving talks on climate change, ozone, for pretty well my entire career, and that's now over 40 years. Over that time, there have been changes in the details of the science and an increasing awareness of the importance, not only studying the issues, but also of doing something about them. I've not had the opportunity to try and connect all the dots between my science and my Christian faith, although there's been such a connection. This talk is somewhat of an attempt to bridge the gap. And put it together, I've had to wade into some very unfamiliar waters, get to grips with some new ideas, and to put them into some coherent order. Okay. It's a pretty condensed talk. Each of the questions asked deserves much more time than we have tonight, and so I've ruthlessly selected and summarized material so that we can go home at a decent hour. If you want more detail about anything, please ask. So I put up 3 questions that I wanted to address. Question 1, is humanity degrading the environment through climate change, pollution, and sheer greed, or is this just a fiction spread by activists with their own agenda? Question 2, if we are impacting the environment, just who is responsible and what shall our reaction be? And question 3, is Christianity an enabler of this degradation, or does it hold the promise of a way out? These 3 questions seem to frame a progression from the scientific questions to the theological questions by way of the ethical questions. I am aware that I'm not an expert in any but the first area, and also, do you know that one of the things that got Galileo into trouble was practicing theology without a license? Okay. So I can consider that either I'm in good company or I'm in great peril. So I'll begin with the scientific questions surrounding mostly climate change, but also impinging on issues such as atmospheric pollution, changes in the ozone layer, because all these problems are linked, and concentrating on one without due consideration of the others leads to bad science. So let's begin at the beginning with a scientific basis on which we build our understanding of climate change, and that particular area known as global warming, which is the result of the greenhouse effect. Although I point out that global warming may only be a minor side effect of what's going on, and the greenhouses do not actually work by the greenhouse effect. Language matters a lot in what I have to say, and ensuring that words mean the same things to everyone is important. Now, the major gases that make up our atmosphere are nitrogen and oxygen, which are actually of little interest in this discussion. The reason is that they neither interact with the vast majority of sunlight pouring down on the planet, nor with the infrared radiation. That's the radiation at longer wavelengths than you can see that is emitted by the planet. It's ultimately the balance between those two, between the solar radiation absorbed by the planet and the infrared radiation emitted by the planet, that determines our planetary condition. If there were no atmosphere, or one just made up of molecular nitrogen and oxygen, then the Earth would be cold. It would be below freezing and just a lump of rock. It's the minor constituents of the atmosphere that make things interesting. And of those, water and carbon dioxide are highly significant because they're transparent to visible radiation. This is this side. And they're opaque to outgoing radiation on this side. They intercept infrared radiation, and as a result of the energy flows that occur, the surface down here becomes warmer. This was first written about by Fourier in the 1820s, and then by Tyndall, Arrhenius, Angstrom, through the 19th century. The basic theory they developed has been unchallenged in the literature since then. We teach it in various forms in many meteorology, climate, and similar courses today. There is no argument about that theory. Water is the most active greenhouse gas. We know that it exists in the gas form and in the liquid form and in the solid form, and there's a very active short-term cycle between those, called the hydrologic cycle in its general form, that determines the concentration of the water in the atmosphere. The influence of humanity on the water concentration in the atmosphere is minimal at the first level, but we're going to return to that point later. The next most active greenhouse gas is carbon dioxide, which differs from water in three major ways. It is nowhere near saturation. Okay? Carbon dioxide is not found in liquid or solid form. It persists for a long time in the atmosphere, decades or longer, and has a much lower concentration. It's about 400 parts per million in the atmosphere. Now, I used to say that it was about 330 parts per million when I started talking about climate change. It's going up significantly, okay, and it's been doing so within one human lifetime, mine. I was born there, and I'm still alive here. Thanks to the pioneering work of Charles Keeling, who actually wasn't originally interested in climate, we have a precise record of carbon dioxide over the last 60 years from a site on the Mauna Loa mountain in the Hawaiian Islands. This curve, known as the Keeling curve, is probably one of the best known graphs of all time. So where did all the CO2 come from? Well, CO2 is produced by burning, and burning occurs in many places. To some extent, we're all burning at the moment. We're taking carbon-bearing compounds, combining them with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide and water vapor. Everybody in this room is generating carbon dioxide or CO2 as we speak. Plants do the reverse. They absorb CO2 and use sunlight to convert it into needed substances in the plant. Some CO2 is produced by forest and bushfires, some absorbs in the ocean, but a lot of it stays in the atmosphere for a long time. Individual molecules can stay around for a few years, but the effects last much longer. Now, if you look at this slide of the carbon fluxes in and out of the atmosphere, you might think that the human bit, which is this one here, which is this bit here, is pretty small. The blue arrows are much bigger. The problem is that the blue arrows, if you add them all up, sum to about 0. The red arrows don't. Hence the Keeling curve. The main reason that CO2 is increasing in the atmosphere is because of the burning of fossil fuels. So if Fourier, Tyndall, and Arrhenius are right, things should be warming up, and indeed they are. Here's some of the latest data. Actually, this was published on Thursday of this week, so it is the latest data. And we have here temperature as a function of time. We're starting very early in the 20th century, working our way up to today. That very last point is 2017. And what we're seeing is that the temperature has risen by something of the order of about 0.8 of a degree in that time. And if that was all that was going on, that will be it as far as the science is concerned. But that isn't all that's going on. There are a lot of other things going on. Planet Earth is anything but a static system, and things are always going on, like regular cycles in the solar output on a decadal timescale. Volcanoes go off now and then. The Earth's path around the sun wobbles due to a theory first worked out by a Serbian geophysicist and astronomer by the name of Milutin Milankovic in the 1920s. And then there are various feedback mechanisms. If CO2 changes, then things get warmer, and if something else happens, then that can either amplify the effect, that's called a positive feedback, or damp the effect, that's called a negative feedback. And a lot of the debate around climate change centers around our understanding of these other things and the magnitude and the role of the feedbacks. Some people believe that the system is very stable and negative feedbacks will keep everything static. And some wonder whether there are tipping points where the feedbacks fail like a snapping elastic and we drop into some new climate state. In the meantime, the temperature is rising. Now, the effects of CO2 are not just in warming the planet. When CO2 is absorbed by the oceans, it forms carbonic acid. That's also in carbonated soft drinks, okay? The stuff that rots your teeth. Okay. And both the warming here, this is the ocean warming, and the acidification, sorry, that's the ocean CO2, sorry, and the acidification, this is becoming more acid as we go down, affect the planetary animal life in the ocean. There are two major effects. Number one is that creatures that make shells from calcium carbonate, their shells get thinner and less protective. Coral reefs suffer as well, both because of the warming and the restriction of the food supply, and that can cause bleaching of the coral reefs and even the death of coral reefs. So before we go on, let me make one very clear point. We are in a very well-defined climate state, and we want to stay there. Does anybody recognize these numbers? 26,000 is the current Dow Jones Industrial Average. Okay? That next enormous number is the world energy consumption in kilowatt hours per year. Okay, you can figure out the bill in 6 cents a kilowatt hour. 7.6 billion is the world population, and that next number is the world gross domestic product in Canadian dollars. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is a measure of the share prices on the New York Stock Exchange. It's commonly used as a measure of our economic success. My point is we live in a very well-developed civilization, and we want to keep it like that. And that demands that we have essentially a static, or at least a very slowly changing climate. The problem is that our actions supply neither. So let's look at a couple of objections to cause for climate change. The first is that scientists are cooking the books to make things agree with their theories. A lot of discussion has arisen about a thing called the hockey stick curve, which shows that temperatures are rising much more rapidly in the last 50 years than formerly. This is one version of the hockey stick curve. That's 1850, 1900, 1950, and now. It's going up. Enter Professor Muller and the Berkeley Earth Surface Temperature Project, BEST. Muller's a physicist. He's not an atmospheric scientist, but he got into this because he pledged to do it right. He was going to reanalyze the data. He was going to avoid all the mistakes of the past. You can read his attentions on that slide there. We are an independent, non-political, non-partisan group. There'll be no spin, whatever et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? Okay? He was viewed by a bit of suspicion by atmospheric scientists, but on the other hand, he was applauded by the skeptics. This is Anthony Watts, who's a well-known skeptic. I'm prepared to accept whatever result they produce, even if it proves my premise wrong. The method isn't the madness we've seen from various organizations. Well, they did the study. Okay, they actually got some money from the Koch brothers, but that's another story. And they produced their results. Their results are in black. NASA's are in blue. NOAA's are in green. And Hadley, which is the UK office, is in red. It's the same curve. Okay. They proved that the original hockey stick curve was right. And there's another example of a comparison. Reaction was mixed after the study. Anthony Watts contended that the study's methodology was flawed because it examined data of a 60-year period instead of the 30-year period. It was the basis for his research. He cited spelling errors as proof of soppiness. Muller himself was more interested. He said, call me a converted skeptic. I concluded that global warming was real and that prior estimates of the rate of warming were correct. I'm now going a step further. That was in relation to some other research. Humans are entirely the cause. I think the next quotations are very apt. When events change, I change my mind. What do you do? When information changes, I alter my... This is attributed to various people. We can't really figure out who said it first, but it seems very apt. Well, then there's the objection that climate's always changing. So what's the big deal? Well, we do have a lot of information on climates in the past, taken from gases and particles stored in layers of ice in Antarctica. Ice is laid down year by year, and if we drill down, we take a time slice going back. I was recently in Germany at the Alfred Wegener Institute, which does a lot of ice work, and I got a chance to actually see one of these ice cores and take a picture of it. So there's a picture of an ice core. Sorry, let's get this right. So the ice core is here in its container. It's about 4 inches in diameter. And this is time going down this axis. And you can see actually in the ice core a dust layer, which was one of the events in the distant past, quite clearly shown there. Now, these and other things enable us to draw pictures of what happened in the past. And there's a core from a place called Vostok, which is quite famous for this. And we can make plots which now go back from now, 100,000 years, 200,000 years, 300,000 years, 400,000 years into the past. If you look at the top line in the graph, which shows a thing called ice volume, and it's upside down just to be awkward. So ice volume was big about 25,000 years ago. That was an ice age. Okay? And there, ice ages happen about every 100,000 years. And then we have this between the interglacial periods that we talk about. Below that is the blue line for carbon dioxide. And you see that carbon dioxide varied from about 180 parts per million here to about 280 parts per million here. Sorry if the scale's a bit small, but I couldn't do much about that. And below that, in red, is the temperature. And the temperature varies by about 10 degrees. Now remember, we're talking about warming due to fossil fuel of a few degrees. 10 degrees is ice age to non-ice age. And we want a static climate. Further, if we take Keeling's curve and try and put it on the plot, we have to, in fact, that's not squashed enough to get the scale right. It's a line going straight up. So this illustrates one very important point about climate change, not just that it's changing, but on relevant timescales, it's changing really, really fast. So yes, we may have another ice age coming in 50,000 years, but the next 100 years is going to see big changes. So this leads to another point, and that is that in geological time, what we're doing is basically just a blip, a sudden spike in the carbon input to the atmosphere, which will end either when we stop doing it or when we run out of carbon. And it'll still be a blip. Now, the technical term for a blip is an impulse function. And there's a branch of learning which deals with the response of systems to impulses and similar inputs. It's called systems analysis. In systems analysis, one of the concepts is what's the response to an impulse function, the impulse response. And people have done experiments on just this. Now, be very careful with this plot. This is the result of a model of what happens when you put a blip of carbon in here in time after the pulse. But the scale changes halfway through. That's the first 100 years. This is 1,000 years. So it's true that all the big things happened in the first 100 years, but 1,000 years into the future, we're still at the 20% mark. We are not only changing the present, we're changing the future. Now, I could go on and on here, but I want to change the subject and look at some aspects of climate change which are less often talked about, the effects and how they're distributed. I can start with this slide from the Globe and Mail this week about the water crisis in Cape Town. The rain patterns have changed, partly due to climate change, not the only reason of the problem. And Cape Town will have to go, Cape Town's a big city, okay, I was there last year. Cape Town will have to go to standpipes on the 21st of April this year, unless something dramatic happens. That means they cut off the water supply, and if you want water, you have to go to some central point and pick it up from there. So much of the climate change is not associated with temperature, although temperature is an issue. The temperature in Sydney, Australia on January the 6th was 43.4 degrees C. One piece of advice for beating the heat was go shopping. Doesn't seem very reasonable. Anyway, in reality, it's the water, stupid. So most of the problems we have are due to changing water patterns. Consider sea level rise, which is due both to the expansion of the oceans because they're warmer and the increased amount of ocean water due to the melting of the glaciers and the ice sheets. Here's the history. Millimeters, 200 millimeters. Okay. Going from about the last century. And here are the predictions in the future. This is the prediction for if we don't do anything about it, and this is the prediction if we do something about it. But that's 800 millimeters by the end of the century, on top of what we've got already. Okay. Now, from where I am standing, we don't have to go very far to reach the ocean, do we? In any direction. Nova Scotia regards sea level rise as a real problem, and even without climate change, storm surges are a real problem. Here's some text from the Nova Scotia Climate Action Plan. We expect warmer average rising sea levels, more frequent extreme storms. Nova Scotia particularly susceptible. Infrastructure located in vulnerable areas wasn't engineered to withstand a higher frequency of extreme whoops, you know. So that sounds bad. But if I ask Google where we are, and you're here, there's the church, that star is 50 meters above sea level. Okay. Consider Bangladesh. For those of you who don't know where Bangladesh is, it's there. Okay. It's a country of 163 million people. Canada's population is 36 million. It's got a gross domestic product per capita of just under $2,000 each. That compares with $52,000 for Canada. Most of the country is within 20 meters of sea level. And a lot of it's within 10 meters of sea level. Just how is Bangladesh supposed to deal with this situation? Oh, and by the way, here's a plot of the carbon emissions by country. Can you find Canada on that? Yeah, Canada's there. Can you find Bangladesh? It's one of these itty-bitty things down here. Okay, it's so small the graphic doesn't even manage to get the name on there. So this leads me to my second question. If we're impacting the environment, just who is responsible and what should our reaction be? And this quote from Desmond Tutu and James Leap frames this as an ethical question. There's another dimension to the climate change debate that does not tend to get as much attention as the environmental and economic impacts. And that is the moral imperative we all share to prevent a massive humanitarian crisis. Global warming is not just an ecological and financial dilemma, it is an ethical one that opens up unsettling questions about justice, fairness, responsibilities, and obligations. I think this graphic captures very well where the problem comes from. It comes from the industrialized nations and the industrializing nations. The rich and the becoming rich. In fact, historically, becoming rich has gone hand in hand with burning fossil fuels and emitting carbon dioxide. Consider this conceptual graph. Population this way, going up, and pollution or degradation of the environment going that way. So long as the population is low and the environment is essentially infinite, then things are okay. We don't have too much to worry about. The society produces little pollution because it's a low population, and the stress on the environment is light. With a few notable exceptions, this is the situation that occurred throughout most of history until a few hundred years ago, and particularly up until about the mid-19th century. In effect, the environment and humanity had a fairly symbiotic relationship. Now that it wasn't necessarily an idyllic state, nature could be cruel and life could be nasty, brutish, and short, as Hobbes put it. Humanity was quite capable of inflicting itself on the environment at times. Life expectancy was not high, diseases were fatal, and infant death rate was astronomical by current standards. Never let us mythologize the past, but understand the situation clearly. As populations increased and population density goes up, then the degradation of the environment starts and bad things start to happen. We saw that with the smogs of London and Los Angeles in the 1950s. And in order to counter that, we need pollution controls, Clean Air Acts, catalytic converters, changing fuel types to damp down the effects, or that red curve will go up and cannot continue. For local problems, we can find local solutions. But this isn't a local problem. The atmosphere is free-flowing and respects no borders. It's a global problem, and we've seen that it originates in the rich and it impacts on the poor. I want to expand on that a bit. The rich countries will cope with climate change. What's the difference in reaction and rate of repair for a natural disaster in a rich country like the USA or Canada, or a poor country like Haiti? Hey, climate change may even be good for the GDP because all the bad effects will need work to repair, and then that increases construction and other activity which raises the GDP. People have even observed darkly that even war can be good for the GDP. But the poor countries do not have resources to cope with massive environmental problems. They will have to live with the consequences. Even moderate countries like South Africa will have significant dislocations because of the changing precipitation patterns, and in the animal and plant kingdoms, species will die. At this point, I want to introduce two competing concepts, two viewpoints of how we look at the world. One is an anthropocentric viewpoint, which regards humans as being the actor whose benefits are being assessed. What's good for humanity? Other species or actors are given little or no weight. On the other pole, you can take a biocentric or big word, non-anthropocentric, regarding the whole planet, with various definitions, as the actor whose benefits are being assessed. Humans are given no more weight than other actors. I think With some exceptions, the first view is the one that's been accepted. But more recently, the second view has been developed and adopted by some. I'm not able to spend the time here, nor am I qualified to develop the reasoning behind these viewpoints, but I will make one observation, and that's a uniqueness in humanity. We're the only species discussing this issue. Depending on your viewpoint, you will have different reactions to these issues. If you have an anthropocentric viewpoint, you will regard the rest of the planet as being subservient to human interests. If you have a biocentric view, you may not. We then have to think about the benefits and what end results we are pursuing, and that leads to three possible methods of evaluation. You can consider utility. So the actors, and the reason I use the word actors is just to avoid, whether it's male, female, humanity, it's whatever. Okay? Actors and actions are weighted according to how they are useful in attaining the desired end. Okay? So burning coal is good if the desired end result is increasing the GDP. On the other hand, you may have a value system. You may decide that actors and actions are given value which is irrespective of their contribution to a desired end. So elephants may be valued because they exist, not because they can haul heavy loads. And then finally, you may have the concept of virtue, which is that actions and attitudes can be right or wrong, irrespective of their utility or values. So humility can be described as a virtue, and bringing humility to the conversation can be discussed as the right thing to do. These are all ways in which you can start framing and talking about the problem. Introduce two more concepts. The first is the idea of a cost-benefit analysis, or CBA. This is beloved of economists, okay, because it gives you an objective way of deciding on the right path. Given that we have identified the desired end and a potential method of reaching that end, then CBA requires us to add up the positives of the method using some scale, subtract the negatives of the method using the same scale, and if the answer is positive, you go ahead, and if it's negative, you don't. So the benefits of large windmills are energy production with no greenhouse gases. The negatives are visual pollution, noise pollution, impact on flying creatures, and go on. The problem with CBA applied to this type of problem is that we first need to decide on a desired end, which may be difficult in itself, and then we need a scale on which to do the evaluation. Exactly what is the value of a zebra? Or a waterfall? Or a mosquito? Maybe you think mosquitoes have negative value. Traditionally, these have been regarded as externalities, and externalities are omitted from the analysis. This is how we come to the point that decisions are made without regard for the environment because the losses to the environment can't be costed, and so we ignore them. This is possibly okay when the population is small and the environment is infinite, but not for a large population with a significant planetary impact. How do we do a CBA on these in a manner we can all agree on? Remember, we may also have different concepts of value as well as different scales. There are some people who believe this can be done, and there are a lot of people who believe it can't. The second concept I want to introduce is the concept of the commons. This goes a long way back in human history to the time when the cattle and sheep of the village were grazed on the common land. No one owned the common land, and everybody had some part in the responsibility for it. You can see how this might apply to the planet as the commons and humanity as the user. There's a nasty problem with the commons, which was identified by William Foster Lloyd, who I note was the Drummond Professor of Political Economy at Christ Church, Oxford. This was later dubbed the tragedy of the commons by Garrett Hardin. The concept is shown on this slide. So let's work through it. Imagine that we have 10 shepherds, each of whom has 100 sheep on the commons, and they're each worth $100 each. So if we multiply all those numbers together, we get $100,000 as the total value of the sheep. One shepherd adds 10 sheep. That results in the grazing being overloaded. And so all the sheep get thinner. The value of the sheep drops to $95, and 1,010 sheep are only valued at $95,950. All the sheep go to market. 9 shepherds get 100 times $95, $9,500. The 10th shepherd, who put the 10 sheep in, gets 110 times 95, $10,450. By not respecting the commons, one shepherd gets the advantage. He actually makes more money than he would otherwise. So why shouldn't all the shepherds do that? But if all the shepherds do that, what happens to the grazing land? Okay. So this problem has been looked at by many researchers, and they've noted a number of mechanisms that have been successful in making a commons successful. You need a mechanism to keep everyone in line. Okay. The first one you can think about is regulations. Thou shalt not have more than 100 sheep. Okay. And then the question is, who makes updates and enforces the regulation? We often think of regulation in terms of government regulation. Zoning, provincial licensing, and so on are examples of this control. The alternative is a consensus where the shepherds self-regulate. And this can be successful if the group is small enough to ensure that everyone complies and there are no shirkers to the agreement. This requires generally a small, homogeneous, well-knit group to accomplish it, and was the situation in village life and still in some religious communities today. Using these tools, we can see why it is so difficult for the world to come to grips with the climate problem. If we try CBA, then we first have to identify the end. Global average temperature shall rise no more than 2 degrees C. One that's been bandied about recently. But now comes the hard part. Do we have an anthropocentric view, in which case we might decide to endure the changes caused by climate change, and too bad on the oceans and the extinct species? On the other hand, if we take a non-anthropocentric view, we might decide that mass extermination of humans, or at least aggressive population control, is a good thing. Are we utilitarian, values-based, or virtues-based in our thinking? Do we value sheep for their wool, or because of their sheepness? Honestly, CBA has immense problems when applied to the planet. Other people have looked at the problems through the lens of the commons. And here too there are problems. Who makes the planetary regulations and enforces them? And there is one group who's not at the table. And that's future generations. Our grandchildren and their grandchildren and so on. I'm grateful for Stephen Gardner for alerting me to this problem. He described climate change as a perfect moral storm and identified 3 aspects to the problem. There is a dispersion of causes and effect. Put simply, the causes are rooted in the industrial and industrializing nations, which are now spatially and temporally separated from the effects which are on the poor and on the future generations. We have no contact with the future generations, and although we have an emotionally sympathetic view to them, we don't take much account of them in our thinking. The quotation, "Why should we do something for posterity? What has posterity ever done for us?" has been attributed to many people, including Groucho Marx and W.C. Fields, but actually seem to be widely held in practice. Witness our ongoing ability to run government deficits, which will have to be continued by our children. The second part of Gardner's perfect storm is the fragmentation of agency. Carbon emission comes from many countries and subunits of countries. Many companies and governments at all levels are involved. corralling these into a coherent response is going to be very hard. The expression herding cats comes to mind. The third element of the storm is institutional inadequacy. We need what Hardin called mutual coercion mutually agreed upon. But our current global institutions are grossly inadequate to that task. The United Nations is getting to be a serious misnomer, and we don't have anything better on the horizon. Gardner makes the point well that some significant part of the reasons why we have continual international meetings on climate change but little substantial action is because of these three factors. So on that somewhat depressing note, I want to pass on to the third question. Is Christianity an enabler of this degradation, or does it hold the promise of a way out? Christianity's had a lot of trouble with authors by the name of White. In 1896, Andrew Dixon White published a 2-volume tome on a history of the warfare of science with theology in Christendom, which was influenced in setting up the conflict hypothesis between science and Christianity. Then, in 1967, Lynn White published a paper in Science titled The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, in which he stated, okay, and this is his statement, and I want you to read it because it's important, since both science and technology are blessed words in our contemporary vocabulary. Some may be happy at the notions first that viewed historically modern science as an extrapolation of natural theology, and second, that modern technology is at least partly to be explained as an occidental voluntarist realization of the Christian dogma of man's transcendence and rightful nature. What he's saying is our science and technology came from our religion. But, as we now recognize somewhat over a century ago, science and technology, hitherto quite separate activities, joined to give mankind powers which, to judge by many of the illogical effects, are out of control. Punchline, if so, Christianity bears a huge burden of guilt. Unlike Dixon White, Lynn White wasn't trying to down Christianity. In fact, his paper goes on to reference St. Francis as somebody who had a more ecological Christian view. In any case, White's paper begs us to evaluate Christian theology in the light of our ecological situation. If we return for a moment to this graph of population and pressures, we must note that for the entire time span of the Bible, the population and the environment were down in this zone. Humanity was not much in contention with nature. In fact, if there was any war between nature and humanity, nature won a lot of the battles. Weather played a great role in whether society flourished or floundered. Wild animals were greatly to be feared, and there was much that was beyond understanding about nature in the ancient world. Against this background, the Bible sets forth some clear aspects of the God-humanity-nature relationship. I'd like to start in Psalm 8 with this declaration, that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it, for he founded it on the seas and established it on the water. With this declaration that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the Bible clearly expresses, and in many other places, that God exercises ownership rights over the whole creation. So what about our place in creation? Well, if you look at Psalm 24, what is mankind that you are mindful of them? Human beings that you care for them. You have made them a little lower than the angels and crowned them with glory and honor. You made them rulers over the works of your hands. You put everything under their feet. Mankind is lower than the angels and above the rest of the creation. But, and as usual it's a big but, the fact that we are above the rest of creation and we've been made rulers over the works of your hands with everything under our feet does not seem to give us license to do everything we want. There is more to this than an abdication of responsibility by God in our favor. One aspect of Psalm 19 is that the creation declares the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech, night after night. They have no speech, they use no words, yet their voice goes out into all the earth. God is glorified in creation. Further, in Psalm 65, God is seen as still very much an actor. He cares for the land. He fills the streams with water, drenches its furrows, talks about what God does. Okay. Now, I picked a lot of quotations from the Psalms because I think they show how the biblical people thought about the God-humanity creation relationship. Now let's look at how their social structures work that out. This was an agrarian economy, if economy is even the right word. But the Israelites were instructed to have a form of tenancy on the land that acknowledged God as the owner. Essentially, the idea was that everyone had a renewable 50-year lease on the land, which couldn't be reassigned at renewal time. So each of you returned to your family property and to your own clan. Between those times, you could sublet the land, but only for the remainder of the lease. There are considerable economic and social ramifications to this idea of land ownership, which was ownership of the means of production. But the essential point I want to make here is that the Israelites were viewed more as managers or stewards of the land than as owners. A very credible summary of the biblical view of the God-humanity creation issue is that humanity is the manager of creation. We are middle managers between God and creation, required to exercise stewardship over creation and accountable to God for that stewardship. And as I have frequently put it, we're in the middle and we're trying to manage. Having made that point, we can now return to a more contentious part of Scripture, Genesis 1. I've given Genesis 1 here in the King James Version because that's how it's often been discussed, and the contentious words are in red. We are to have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air and over every living thing upon the earth. And a quick read would associate dominion with domination and all its negative aspects. But as we've seen, the relationship to creation is a lot more complicated than that. And while admitting that the dominion reading will be valid, in the light of the rest of the Scripture, a more reasonable stewardship approach seems to be what's intended. Now, the early church fathers didn't spend a lot of time in ecology because they were still on the bottom end of that curve. But both Thomas Aquinas here talks about God brought beings into existence that his goodness might be communicated to creatures and reacted through them, and so on, talking, hence the whole universe, less incompletely than one alone, shares and represents his goodness, talks about this idea of God in creation. It's also fair to point out that Aquinas' view of creation was very anthropocentric and hierarchical, okay, as well as being respectful. John Calvin also asserted a theocentric view of creation. We see the world with our eyes, we tread the earth with our hands, we touch innumerable kinds of God's works with our hands, and so on. And the last line's pretty good. Therefore, let men be satisfied if they attain only a moderate taste of them, suited to their capacity. And G.K. Chesterton, in his book Orthodoxy, while arguing against what we might see as a form of biocentricity, likens nature to our younger sister. I love this quote. The main point of Christianity was this, and please, that was in this context, okay? Don't take that as an absolute. That nature is not our mother, nature is our sister. We can be proud of her beauty since we have the same father, but she has no authority over us. We have to admire, but not to imitate. This gives to the typical Christian pleasure in this earth a strange touch of lightness that is almost frivolity. To St. Francis, nature is a sister, and even a younger sister, a little dancing sister to be laughed at as well as loved. My response to that could be summarized as, don't mess with my sister. Chesterton was perhaps the last person who wrote from the bottom of that curve. And we're living well up into the region where we have to manage between the creation and humanity. We are now truly the middle managers in a world that's become very complex. Since Lynn White made his trumpet call to contemporary Christians, there's been a great awakening among us about the importance of stewardship, or creation care as it is now called. I typed creation care into Amazon.ca books and came up with 1,000 hits. Not all of these are relevant, but many of them are. It's a hot topic. And one of the most influential papers on this subject recently has been the Papal Encyclical Laudato Si by Pope Francis in 2015, which is subtitled on care for our common home. The Pope's theology is undoubtedly better than mine, but what I found most interesting about the document is that it firmly links many of the social and environmental inequalities and harms in our society together and shows how they feed off one another. We need to break the cycle if we are to achieve lasting change. As Christians, we're called not to be out of this world, as one wag put it, so heavenly minded that we're no earthly good, but in this world, but not of it. We can be unashamedly counterculture. Listen to John Calvin again. Let him who possesses a field so partake of its yearly fruits that he may not suffer the ground to be injured by his negligence, but let him endeavour to hand it down to posterity as he received it, or even better cultivate. Calvin got the generational bit. We can see emerging from this body of work a third way of looking at the world. We should add to the anthropocentric and non-anthropocentric viewpoints the theocentric viewpoint, in that we are stewards of God's creation and holding ourselves accountable to Him for our usage of it. We now map that back into the ways of assigning value and attitudes, but now with a proper theo prefix on them. So we talk about theo-utility. Actors and actions are weighted according to how useful they are in attaining God's purpose. Theo-values. Actors and actions are given value as they have value to God. And theo-virtue. Actions and attitudes can be right or wrong, depending on whether they follow God's will. So what does that mean in practice? So what? I would say that it answers the number one problem in climate, which is that the cause of the problem is the industrialized and industrializing nation, and the effects fall mainly on the poor. The Bible is absolutely adamant in verse after verse that this is wrong. The poor are God's special project and an object of His considerable interest. In my opinion, one of the most frightening parables that Jesus taught was the one about the sheep and the goats. In that parable, whether you got to heaven or not depended not upon the jots and tittles of your theology, but how you treated the poor and the stranger. The second issue that it answers is the one about our relation to nature. Chesterton's lyrical illustration is bang on. Nature is our laughing little sister, and we should not be messing with our sister. Of course, nothing is perfect in this fallen world. And I would be completely misrepresenting things if I put forward the idea that these ideas do not collide at times. We need to feed the world. 7.6 billion people cannot live on this planet without having a substantial impact. I get considerably upset with people who imagine that the situation can be resolved in some pure way. Compromises will be needed, but it is our managerial responsibility to God to thread that needle as best we can, showing respect to all sides, knowing that we are under God and we will account to him for our stewardship. I close with a few things for you to think about. The first is some statistics on what's happening in the world now, and to re-emphasize the difference between the source regions and the... So the world usage is 1,000 barrels of oil a second. A barrel's, one of these big... Okay. North America uses 28% of that and has about 5% of the population. Water usage. North American citizen, 1,650 meters cubed per year. I didn't translate that into swimming pools or anything like that. Bangladesh, 100, you just see the size of the numbers. Sea level rise, 150 million refugees. That's 50% of the population. Yeah. The burden will not fall on the first world. That has the resources to deal with the problem. But on the third world, which is not. Some quotations to think about. Back to Psalm 24. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness and everything in it. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground, apart from the will of your Father. God cares for creation. Marshall McLuhan, a good Canadian, there are no passengers on Spaceship Earth. We are all crew. Edmund Burke, speaking directly to the feeling that this is just overwhelming. Nobody makes a greater mistake than he who does nothing because he could only do a little. And this last one, which I saw on the wall of a restaurant in Disneyland, Florida, of all places, has stuck with me for years. We should take care of planet Earth because you can't buy another one. And I think the reason it sticks is that word buy. From another white writer, we have 6 principles. I won't put them up more quickly than that. Six principles you might like to think about. Value and protect creation, seeing that as a joy rather than a burden. Reflect the close bond between society and the environment in our decisions. Pursue justice for the vulnerable and the marginalized. Do not confuse wealth and value. Favor regulated market-based solutions that take account of natural, human, and social capital. Express commitment to our local environment and favor local solutions and respond seriously and with hope. And that was another white writer. And finally, here is the answer to all those who are unconvinced about climate, even after all the arguments presented by innumerable scientists around the world. Would it be just a bad thing if we just got on with it and created a better world? Thank you.